She counted the coins twice, hoping the number would somehow change. The cabin lights were dimmed to a soft amber glow, the kind that made everything feel quieter than it really was, but Emily Carter could still hear every small sound as if it had been amplified just for her. The low hum of the engines, the faint rustle of magazines, the soft clink of something metal shifting in her trembling hand. She kept her head down, shoulders slightly curved inward, trying to make herself smaller in a seat that already felt too narrow. Her fingers moving carefully over the few coins resting in her palm as if precision alone might make them enough. A quarter. 2 dimes. 3 pennies. She paused, then counted again, slower this time, pressing each coin against her thumb like she needed to feel their weight to believe they were real. Still was not enough. Not even close. The tray table in front of her held a small paper receipt, the total printed in dark ink that didn't care how tired she was or how hard she had tried to make things stretch, and for a brief second she closed her eyes, not in defeat, but in calculation, her mind moving quickly through numbers, through what she had left, through what she could still manage when the plane touched down. Somewhere ahead, a flight attendant was making her way down the aisle, her steps measured, professional, the cart rolling softly over the carpet, stopping row by row. A quiet routine that had nothing to do with Emily and yet felt like it was coming straight toward her. Emily shifted slightly in her seat, glancing toward the window for a moment, the dark sky offering no answers, only a reflection of her own face, pale under the cabin lights, eyes carrying more worry than she wanted anyone to see. She adjusted the sleeve of her sweater, pulling it down over her wrist, a small habit she had developed when she needed to steady herself, and then she looked back at the coins, arranging them neatly on the tray as if order could somehow make them sufficient. The cart moved closer. 1 row away now. A man across the aisle accepted his drink with a polite nod, barely looking up from his phone, the world continuing around her without interruption, without awareness, and that, somehow, made it harder. Emily took a slow breath, her chest rising just enough to remind her she was still in control, still capable of handling this, even if handling it meant admitting she didn't have what was needed. The flight attendant stopped beside her row, her smile professional, her tone gentle but efficient. "Ma'am, will you be paying for that now?" Emily looked up and for a moment everything stilled, not the plane, not the people, just something inside her that had been holding itself together all day. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, her fingers instinctively gathering the coins back into her hand as if she could hide them before they were fully seen. "I just need a second," she said, her voice soft, controlled, but thinner than she intended. The attendant nodded, waiting, not impatient, but present in a way that left no room to disappear. Emily glanced down again, counting one more time, slower, quieter, as if repetition could create a different outcome. It did not. Across the aisle, a man in a dark suit sat still, his posture relaxed, his attention no longer on the device in his hand but on the small, contained moment unfolding just a few feet away. Daniel Hayes had noticed her long before the coins, before the receipt, before the question that now lingered in the air. He had seen the way she had boarded, the careful way she had held her bag, the way her eyes had scanned the cabin not for comfort, but for calculation, and now, as he watched her struggle to hold on to her composure, he didn't look away. He didn't move either. Not yet. Because some moments, he had learned, revealed more in silence than they ever could in interruption. And this one, quiet as it was beginning to say everything. Emily felt the second stretch just a little too long as the flight attendant remained beside her, patient but unmoving, and in that quiet pause the small space around her seemed to tighten, as if every breath had to pass through a narrower place before it reached her lungs. She gathered the coins into her palm again, closing her fingers around them this time, not to count, but to hold, as if keeping them hidden might somehow give her a moment more to think. "I am sorry," she said softly, lifting her eyes just enough to meet the attendant's gaze without fully exposing the weight behind them. "I thought I had enough." The words were simple, but they carried more than the situation required, something deeper, something that had followed her long before this flight and would likely follow her after it landed. The attendant's expression shifted, just slightly, from routine to understanding, but not enough to change the reality in front of them. "It is okay," she replied gently. "Take your time." Emily nodded, though she knew time was not what she needed. Time wouldn't change the number in her hand. It wouldn't add a missing dollar or stretch what she had into what was required. She placed the coins carefully on the tray again, aligning them in a small, neat row, her movements deliberate, controlled, as if dignity could be preserved through precision alone. Around her, the cabin continued its quiet rhythm. A man laughing softly at something on his phone, a woman adjusting a blanket over her lap, the soft clink of ice in a plastic cup, all of it moving forward without pause, without awareness of the small moment unfolding just a few feet away. Emily inhaled slowly, her shoulders lifting slightly before settling again, and for a brief second she considered saying the words she had spent years avoiding, the ones that always felt heavier than they should have, the ones that made everything feel more real than she wanted it to be. She almost said them. Then she stopped. Across the aisle, Daniel watched the shift, the subtle change in her posture, the hesitation that came not from confusion, but from pride, from a refusal to let a temporary moment define her in front of strangers. He recognized it immediately, not because he had lived it, but because he had spent enough time observing people to understand when something mattered more than the surface suggested. His gaze moved briefly to the coins on her tray, then back to her face, noting the way she held herself together, the way she chose silence over explanation. He could have spoken already. The solution was simple. A card. A word. A quick gesture that would end the moment before it deepened. But he didn't move. Not yet. Because he understood something else. Timing mattered. Too early. It would feel like interruption. Too obvious. It would feel like exposure. He waited instead, allowing the moment to reach its natural edge, the point where her choice would become clear. Emily exhaled quietly, her fingers brushing the coins once more before she gathered them back into her hand, this time with a different intention, not to count, but to put them away. "It is fine," she said, her voice steady now, more certain than before. "You can take it back." The attendant hesitated for a fraction of a second, then nodded, her professionalism returning to the surface as she reached for the item on the tray. Emily offered a small, polite smile, the kind that asked for nothing and revealed even less, and as the cart began to move again, she lowered her gaze to the empty space in front of her, her reflection faint in the dark screen of the seat monitor. For a moment it was quiet again. Not peaceful. Just still. Daniel's hand moved then, slow, deliberate, reaching into the inside pocket of his jacket as if the decision had already been made long before the motion itself. He didn't look at her as he placed his card gently on the edge of her tray, the movement smooth, almost incidental, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Add it to mine," he said, his voice low, calm, directed toward the attendant without drawing attention. The words were simple. The effect was not. Emily's head lifted immediately, her eyes shifting from the tray to him, surprise flickering across her expression before it settled into something more guarded. The space between them changed in an instant, no longer defined by distance alone, but by the presence of a choice neither of them could ignore. Emily didn't reach for the card right away. Her eyes stayed on it for a second longer than necessary, as if she needed to confirm it was real before deciding what to do with it, and when she finally looked up at him, there was no gratitude in her expression yet, only caution, the kind that comes from learning not to accept help without understanding the cost attached to it. "You don't have to do that," she said quietly, her voice steady but firm, each word chosen with care. Daniel didn't turn his head immediately. His gaze remained forward, giving her the space to speak without feeling watched. His posture relaxed, as if the moment didn't require urgency. "I know," he replied, his tone calm, almost neutral, but there was something deliberate in the way he said it, something that suggested the decision had nothing to do with obligation. Emily shifted slightly in her seat, her fingers tightening around the edge of the tray for just a moment before she released it, grounding herself again. The flight attendant hesitated between them, her eyes moving from one to the other, waiting for a clear resolution. But neither of them rushed to provide one. The silence stretched, not awkward, but full, carrying more meaning than either of them needed to explain. "I can handle it," Emily added after a second, softer this time, not defensive, just honest, as if she needed him to understand that what she was protecting was not the money, but something deeper. Daniel turned his head then, finally meeting her gaze directly, his expression composed, but not distant. "I believe you," he said. The words landed differently than she expected, not challenging her, not dismissing her, but acknowledging her without taking anything away from her. It was not what she had prepared herself to hear. Emily blinked once, the tension in her shoulders easing just slightly, though her posture remained upright, controlled. The attendant cleared her throat gently, a quiet reminder that the moment couldn't remain suspended forever, and Daniel shifted his card a fraction closer to the edge of the tray, not pushing it toward Emily, not placing it in her hand, just leaving it there, available but not forced. "You can return it," he added, his voice still low, still even. "Whenever it makes sense." Emily looked at the card again, then back at him, searching for something in his expression that might reveal expectation, or judgment, or even subtle pity. But she didn't find it. What she found instead was something harder to define, something steady, something that didn't seem to need anything from her in return. The attendant, sensing the quiet shift, reached for the card and completed the transaction without further comment, her movements smooth, practiced, as if she had witnessed enough moments like this to understand when not to interrupt them. Emily exhaled slowly as the cart moved on, the small item now resting on her tray again, paid for. But not entirely settled in her mind. She didn't touch it. Not yet. Instead, she folded her hands together, resting them lightly in her lap, her gaze fixed forward for a moment before she allowed herself to glance back at him once more. "Thank you," she said finally, the words simple, but not empty, carrying a weight that came from the effort it had taken to say them. Daniel inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the words without expanding on them, as if he understood that anything more might shift the balance of the moment. "You are welcome," he replied. The conversation could have ended there. It almost did. But something lingered, something unspoken that neither of them moved to dismiss. Emily adjusted the sleeve of her sweater again, the familiar motion returning, and this time when she looked toward the window, her reflection seemed just a little different, not lighter, not solved, but less alone than it had been before. And beside her, Daniel leaned back into his seat, his gaze drifting briefly toward the dark sky outside before returning forward, his expression unchanged to anyone else. But somewhere beneath that stillness, something had shifted, quietly, almost imperceptibly, in a way that wouldn't reveal itself all at once, but would continue to unfold long after the plane touched the ground. The cabin settled into a quieter rhythm after that moment, as if nothing significant had happened, as if the small exchange between them hadn't shifted something invisible in the space they shared. And yet for Emily, the stillness that followed felt different, less suffocating, less sharp around the edges. She rested her hands in her lap, fingers loosely intertwined now, no longer gripping, no longer bracing, and for the first time since she had taken her seat, she allowed her shoulders to relax just slightly, the tension easing in a way she hadn't planned, but couldn't quite resist. The item on her tray remained untouched, not because she didn't want it, but because touching it felt like acknowledging more than she was ready to process, so instead she focused on something simpler, the steady hum of the plane, the faint vibration beneath her feet, the quiet reassurance that forward motion was happening whether she controlled it or not. A few minutes passed before she spoke again, not out of obligation, but because the silence between them no longer felt like something to avoid. "You didn't have to wait," she said, her voice soft but clearer now, her gaze angled slightly toward him without fully turning. Daniel shifted his attention to her, his expression composed as always, though there was a subtle openness in the way he listened, something that suggested he was not simply passing time. "I was not waiting," he replied. The answer was simple, but it carried a quiet precision that made her pause, as if there was more meaning in it than the words alone suggested. Emily tilted her head slightly, considering that, her brow softening as she tried to understand what he meant. Not pushing, just curious in a way that felt safe. "Then what were you doing?" she asked, the question gentle, almost cautious, as if she was testing whether the conversation could move beyond what had already been said. Daniel leaned back a fraction in his seat, not retreating, but settling, his gaze steady as he answered. "Paying attention." The words landed in a way she didn't expect, not dramatic, not overly significant, but honest in a way that felt rare, especially in a place filled with strangers who rarely noticed one another beyond convenience. Emily looked down briefly, absorbing that, her fingers brushing lightly against the fabric of her sleeve before she let out a quiet breath. "Most people do not," she said, almost to herself, though the words were meant to be heard. Daniel didn't respond immediately. He allowed the statement to exist without correcting it, without disagreeing, as if he understood that her perspective had been shaped by more than this single moment. The plane shifted slightly as it adjusted its altitude, a gentle movement that caused a few passengers to glance up before returning to their own thoughts, and Emily found herself watching the reflection in the window again, her face no longer as tense as it had been earlier, though still marked by the weight of everything she carried beyond this flight. "Are you traveling for work?" she asked after a moment, the question simple, neutral, a way to move forward without stepping too far into unfamiliar territory. Daniel nodded once. Yes. He didn't elaborate. She didn't press him, accepting the answer for what it was, a boundary that didn't feel closed, just measured. "Me too," she said quietly, though the words held a different kind of truth, one that extended beyond a job description, beyond a destination printed on a ticket. For her, travel had never been about convenience or routine. It was necessity, movement because staying still was no longer an option. Daniel's gaze remained on her for a second longer, as if he recognized the difference without needing it explained, and then he looked forward again, giving her the same space he had offered from the beginning. The cabin lights dimmed further as the flight moved into the later hours, the world outside the window turning darker, deeper, the horizon barely visible now, and within that quiet, something settled between them, not a connection fully formed, not yet, but the beginning of one, shaped not by grand gestures or immediate understanding, but by something far simpler, something that often went unnoticed, the willingness to see someone else without needing to define them, and to be seen even for a moment without having to explain everything that brought you there. The conversation didn't end after that, but it changed its pace, settling into something quieter, something that didn't demand attention yet held it all the same, like a steady current beneath still water. Emily shifted slightly in her seat, her body no longer rigid, though not entirely at ease either, her awareness of him still present, but no longer overwhelming. She reached for the small item on her tray at last, her fingers brushing against it carefully, almost thoughtfully, as if accepting it required more than a simple motion, and when she finally picked it up, she did so without looking at him, her gaze directed forward, her posture composed. "I will return it," she said, not as a promise meant to impress, but as a statement of fact, something she needed to say for herself more than for him. Daniel inclined his head slightly, acknowledging the words without questioning them, his expression unchanged, though there was a quiet understanding in his eyes that suggested he had never expected anything less. "I am sure you will," he replied, his tone even, not dismissive, not indulgent, simply accepting. Emily exhaled softly, the tension in her chest easing just a fraction more, and for a moment, neither of them spoke again, the silence between them now carrying a different kind of weight, not awkward, not uncertain, but settled, as if something had already been agreed upon without needing further explanation. The cabin lights dimmed further as the flight moved deeper into the night, casting softer shadows across the rows of passengers, many of whom had begun to drift into sleep, their conversations fading, their movements slowing, the world inside the plane narrowing to quiet breaths and distant engine noise. Emily leaned her head back against the seat, her eyes closing for a brief second before opening again, not fully ready to rest, her thoughts still moving, still calculating, but no longer as sharp, no longer as urgent as they had been earlier. She glanced toward him again, this time more directly, her expression less guarded, though still careful. "Do you always notice things like that?" she asked, her voice low, almost conversational now, as if the question had formed naturally from the space they had created between them. Daniel looked at her, his gaze steady, considering the question for a moment before answering. "Not always," he said. "Only when it matters." The simplicity of the response caught her off guard, not because it was surprising, but because it felt honest in a way that didn't require explanation, and for a second she found herself holding his gaze longer than she intended, searching for something she couldn't quite define. "And this mattered?" she asked, the question softer now, less about the situation, more about what it meant. Daniel didn't hesitate this time. "Yes." The word was quiet, but certain. It lingered between them longer than expected, settling into a place that neither of them moved to disrupt. Emily looked away first, not out of discomfort, but because she needed a moment to absorb what that answer implied, not about him, but about how he had seen her, not as a problem to solve, not as a situation to fix, but as something worth noticing. She folded her hands again in her lap, her fingers resting more loosely this time, and as she turned her attention back to the window, the reflection staring back at her felt different again, not transformed, not entirely free of worry, but steadier, as if something inside her had shifted just enough to change the way she held everything else. The plane continued its quiet path through the night, miles passing beneath them unseen, and beside her, Daniel remained still, his presence no longer defined by distance or silence, but by something quieter, something that didn't need to be named to be understood. A connection formed not through grand gestures or shared history, but through a single moment of recognition. The choice to respond to it without expectation. The hours that followed passed in a quiet rhythm that felt almost suspended outside of time, the kind of stillness that only existed in places where movement was constant but purpose felt distant, and Emily found herself drifting in and out of thought rather than sleep, her mind no longer racing, but not entirely at rest either. At some point she must have closed her eyes for more than a moment, because when she opened them again, the cabin had changed, the lights dimmed further, the soft glow of individual screens casting faint reflections across the aisle, and for a second she didn't remember where she was, only that she was no longer holding on to the same tension she had boarded with. She adjusted slightly in her seat, her shoulders easing back as she became aware of the quiet around her, and then her gaze shifted instinctively toward the space beside her. Daniel was still there, though his posture had changed, his head tilted slightly as if he had allowed himself a brief moment of rest, one hand resting loosely on the armrest, the other still near the pocket where he had earlier reached for his card. There was something unexpectedly human in that stillness, something that didn't match the composed precision he had carried before, and Emily watched him for a second longer than she intended, not studying him, not analyzing, just noticing. She looked away first, her attention returning to the window, the darkness outside now softened by a faint line of early light along the horizon, a subtle shift that suggested morning was closer than it had been. The captain's voice came over the speaker not long after, calm and measured, announcing their initial descent. The simple statement brought with it a quiet awareness that this temporary space they had shared was nearing its end. Emily straightened slightly, her hand moving to smooth the front of her sweater out of habit, her mind already shifting back toward what waited for her after landing, the responsibilities, the uncertainties, the careful planning that had defined so much of her life. For a moment she considered saying something more than what had already passed between them. But the words didn't come easily, not because there was nothing to say, but because she was not sure what would belong to this moment and what would not. Daniel opened his eyes then, almost as if he had sensed the shift beside him, his expression returning quickly to its usual calm, though there was a softness to it that hadn't been there before. He glanced toward her briefly, acknowledging her presence without interrupting it, and then looked forward again, as if allowing her to decide whether the silence would remain or change. "We are landing soon," Emily said after a moment, her voice quiet but steady, the statement simple, but carrying more weight than the words alone suggested. Daniel nodded once. "Yes." The response was brief, but it didn't close the space between them, it held it open just enough. Emily hesitated, her fingers brushing lightly against the edge of the tray before settling back into her lap, and then she turned slightly toward him, not fully, but enough to meet his gaze again. "I meant what I said," she added, her tone measured, certain. "I will return it." Daniel met her eyes, his expression composed, but attentive, as if he understood that this was not about the amount, but about something far more important to her. "I know," he said. He didn't ask how. He didn't ask when. He didn't ask for anything at all. The plane began its gradual descent, the subtle shift in pressure barely noticeable, but present, and as the ground slowly drew closer beneath them, the moment between them settled into something final, not because it had ended, but because it had reached a point where it couldn't remain unchanged. Emily looked forward again, her posture straight, her expression calm, and though nothing about her situation had been resolved, something within her had been steadied in a way she hadn't expected. Beside her, Daniel remained still, his attention no longer fixed on her, but not entirely removed either, as if the moment they had shared had already moved beyond this flight, beyond this narrow space, into something that wouldn't simply disappear once they stepped onto separate paths. And as the plane moved closer to the ground, carrying them both toward lives that had been entirely separate only hours before, there was a quiet sense, almost imperceptible, that what had begun in silence wouldn't end there, but continue in a way neither of them had planned, shaped not by circumstance alone, but by the simple choice to notice and to respond. The wheels touched the runway with a soft, steady impact that echoed briefly through the cabin, and for a moment, everything shifted from suspended stillness back into motion, the quiet world they had shared giving way to the reality waiting beyond the aircraft doors. Emily felt it immediately, the familiar return of urgency, not sharp, not overwhelming, but present enough to remind her that this was never meant to last. She adjusted her seatbelt as the plane slowed, her gaze forward, her expression composed, as if she were already preparing to step back into the version of herself that didn't allow for pauses, that moved from one responsibility to the next without hesitation. Around her, passengers began to stir, the subtle rhythm of travel returning, overhead bins opening, voices rising just slightly, the shared silence dissolving into individual concerns. Emily reached for her bag beneath the seat, her movements careful and efficient, each action grounded in routine, in the quiet discipline she had built over time. Beside her, Daniel remained still for a moment longer, watching the transition without rushing into it, his posture unchanged even as the environment shifted around him, as if he understood that what mattered had already happened before the plane had even begun its descent. When he finally reached for his belongings, his movements were deliberate, unhurried, each gesture controlled in a way that contrasted with the growing restlessness in the aisle. The plane came to a complete stop. The familiar chime sounded, releasing passengers from their seats, and with it came the subtle tension of movement, people standing too quickly, reaching for bags, stepping into the narrow aisle with quiet impatience. Emily remained seated for a second longer than necessary, not because she was hesitant, but because she understood the rhythm of this moment, the way rushing rarely changed the outcome. She stood when it made sense, lifting her bag over her shoulder, her posture straight, her expression calm, though there was a quiet awareness in her eyes now, something that hadn't been there before this flight. Daniel stood as well, though he didn't move into the aisle immediately, allowing the space to fill before stepping forward, his presence steady, unobtrusive, despite the natural authority he carried. For a brief moment they stood beside each other again, closer now than they had been since the beginning, the shared space narrowing as the line of passengers began to move toward the exit. Emily glanced at him once more, not searching, not questioning, just acknowledging, and there was something final in that look, something that suggested she understood this moment might not extend beyond the next few minutes. "This is where it ends," she said quietly, her voice steady, not regretful, not expectant, simply stating what felt true. Daniel looked at her, his expression composed, though there was a subtle shift beneath it, something quieter, something that didn't fully agree with the simplicity of her words. "Maybe," he replied, the answer open, not dismissing her, but not confirming it either. The line moved forward, and with it, the distance between them began to change, not abruptly, but inevitably, each step carrying them closer to separate paths. As they reached the front of the cabin, the flight attendant offered a polite smile, the same routine gesture given to every passenger, and for a moment, it felt as if everything that had happened between them had been folded into something small enough to disappear in the flow of ordinary moments. Emily stepped forward first, moving into the jet bridge, the air slightly cooler, the space narrower, the world outside the plane already pressing in. She didn't look back immediately, not because she didn't want to, but because she understood that some moments were not meant to be held onto by turning around. Still, after a few steps, she paused just briefly, her hand tightening slightly on the strap of her bag before she allowed herself one final glance over her shoulder. Daniel was still there, a few steps behind, his gaze steady, meeting hers without hesitation, without distance. And in that single silent exchange something remained, not defined, not promised, but present, a quiet thread that neither of them moved to break, even as the space between them continued to grow. The jet bridge narrowed into the terminal, and with each step Emily took, the quiet space that had existed between her and Daniel began to dissolve into something more ordinary, more expected, the kind of transition she had learned to navigate without hesitation. The airport air felt different, cooler, sharper, carrying the distant hum of conversations, rolling suitcases, overhead announcements that blurred into one another without needing to be understood. She adjusted her grip on her bag as she moved forward, her pace steady, her focus returning to what came next, where she needed to be, how quickly she could get there, how much she still had to manage before the day fully unfolded. Behind her, Daniel stepped into the same space, though his movement carried a different weight, not urgency, not pressure, but awareness, as if he recognized that something had shifted and was now moving beyond the boundaries of a shared flight into something less predictable. Emily didn't stop. She followed the flow of passengers through the corridor, down the escalator, into the wide openness of the terminal where everything expanded again, space, noise, distance, and for a moment, she felt the familiar pull of anonymity returning, the sense that whatever had happened above the clouds might simply fade into memory if she allowed it to. She reached into her bag briefly, her fingers brushing against the small receipt she had folded and tucked away, a quiet reminder that the moment had been real, that it hadn't been imagined or exaggerated by circumstance. She paused near the base of the escalator, not fully stopping, just enough to reorient herself, to decide which direction to take next, and in that brief hesitation she became aware of something else, not a sound, not a call, but a presence that hadn't entirely fallen away behind her. She turned slightly, not fully, just enough to see him again. Daniel stood a short distance away, not following too closely, not attempting to close the space, simply present, his posture composed, his expression unchanged to anyone else passing by. But there was a quiet clarity in the way he looked at her, as if the moment between them hadn't ended, only shifted into a different setting. Emily held his gaze for a second longer this time, the movement of people around them continuing without pause, creating a kind of moving frame that made their stillness stand out without drawing attention. She could have walked away then. It would have been the simplest choice, the most practical, the one that aligned with everything she had learned about protecting her time, her energy, her focus. But she didn't move. Not yet. Instead, she reached into her bag again, pulling out the receipt she had folded earlier, her fingers smoothing it once before she stepped slightly to the side, creating just enough space to stand without being carried forward by the crowd. When he approached, he did so without urgency, without assumption, stopping at a respectful distance that allowed her to remain in control of the moment. "You said I could return it," she said, holding the receipt lightly between her fingers, her voice calm. But there was a subtle shift in it now, something more grounded, more certain than before. Daniel looked at the receipt, then back at her, his expression steady, as if he had expected this, not in detail, but in principle. "I did," he replied. Emily nodded once, her grip on the paper loosening slightly. "Then tell me how," she said. The question was simple, but it carried more than just a transaction, it carried intention, a refusal to let the moment remain unfinished, a choice to follow through rather than let it dissolve into something temporary. Daniel held her gaze for a second, considering, and then he reached into his pocket, not for a card this time, but for something smaller, something less formal, writing quickly before handing it to her without explanation. She took it, her fingers brushing against his for the briefest second, the contact light, almost accidental, but enough to register, enough to shift the air between them once more. Emily glanced down at the paper, then back at him, her expression unreadable for a moment before it settled into something quieter, something that didn't need to be spoken aloud. Around them, the terminal continued to move, people passing, voices rising and fading, the world carrying on as it always did, and yet within that motion, something had been set in place, not dramatic, not overwhelming, but real, a continuation that neither of them had planned, but both had chosen, one small decision at a time. Emily stood there for a moment longer after he handed her the small piece of paper, the movement around them continuing as if nothing had shifted, as if this was just another exchange between strangers in a crowded airport. But she knew it was not. She folded the paper carefully, not rushing the motion, as if the act itself required intention, then slipped it into the inner pocket of her bag, somewhere safe, somewhere she wouldn't forget. When she looked back up, Daniel was still there, exactly where he had been, not waiting in a way that demanded anything, but not leaving either, as if he understood that some moments needed to settle before they could move forward. "I won't lose it," she said quietly, her voice steady, her gaze direct, not offering reassurance for him, but confirming something for herself. Daniel nodded once, the gesture small, but certain. "I didn't think you would," he replied. The simplicity of the exchange left no room for anything unnecessary. No expectation, no pressure, just a shared understanding that didn't need to be expanded. For a second, neither of them spoke again, and in that pause, the noise of the terminal seemed to fade just slightly, not because it had actually quieted, but because their attention had shifted away from it. Emily adjusted the strap of her bag on her shoulder, the familiar motion grounding her once more, reminding her of the path she had to continue, the life waiting just beyond this unexpected moment. She glanced toward the exit signs overhead, then back at him, the decision already forming before she spoke. "I should go," she said, not apologizing, not hesitating, simply stating what was true. Daniel didn't try to stop her. He didn't offer an alternative. He simply inclined his head again, acknowledging the choice without challenging it. "Safe travels," he said. The words were ordinary, something anyone might say in a place like this, and yet coming from him in this moment they carried a different weight, something quieter, something that lingered. Emily gave a small nod in return, her expression calm, though there was a softness in it now that hadn't been there before. She turned then, stepping back into the flow of movement, her pace steady, her posture straight, blending into the rhythm of people heading toward their own destinations. She didn't look back immediately. Not this time. Because something about the moment felt complete enough to carry forward without needing to be confirmed again. Behind her, Daniel remained where he was for a second longer, watching as the distance between them grew, not rapidly, not dramatically, but in the quiet, inevitable way that distance always does. He could have called out. He could have closed the space in a few quick steps. But he did neither. Because he understood something that had taken years to learn. Not every connection needed to be held tightly to remain real. Some needed space. Some needed time. Emily reached the terminal exit, the doors sliding open automatically as she approached, letting in a rush of cooler air that carried the scent of the outside world. A reminder that life was continuing beyond this building, beyond this moment. She stepped through without hesitation, her gaze forward, her mind already shifting toward what came next. The ride she needed to find, the child waiting for her at home, the responsibilities that hadn't paused while she was in the air. And yet, as she walked, her hand moved briefly to the pocket where she had placed the folded paper, her fingers resting there for just a second, a quiet acknowledgement that something unexpected had been added to the life she was returning to. Not a solution, not a promise, just a possibility. Back inside the terminal, Daniel finally turned as well, his own path waiting, his schedule already beginning to fill the space that had briefly been occupied by something else, something less structured, less predictable. As he moved toward the opposite exit, his expression returned to its usual composure. But the stillness beneath it was different now, altered in a way that couldn't be seen from the outside. They left in opposite directions, their lives continuing along the lines they had followed long before this flight, and yet somewhere between the miles they had crossed and the few words they had shared, something had shifted quietly, almost imperceptibly, leaving behind not a grand change, but a small steady echo, the kind that doesn't demand attention, but stays with you anyway, reminding you that sometimes, the moments that matter most begin in silence, and continue long after the noise returns.